Good morning. Thank you to Jonathan and John and Sylvia. Thank you to the worship team. It's been a great morning so far. And we are in the middle of a message series that we're calling Better, because everybody wants something better in their life, right? Maybe you even wanted a better morning this morning. I walked out of Panera this morning and had an interesting encounter. A lady was driving and she paused and waved me and another gentleman through, so we could pass by. And we politely waved to her and thanked her as we made our way. And then I noticed she stopped and rolled down her window, and she said, she had a German accent or Eastern European accent. She said, "On the other hand, I could use a good-looking hood ornament." And I was like, oh, okay. I'm not sure if you're threatening me or flirting with me or what, but I have a good, bad, weird feeling right now. Hopefully you had a great morning so far. If not, I'm going to try to put a smile on your face before you leave today. We're in this series on Better, and we're actually reading from the book of Hebrews. And last week we read Hebrews 1 through 3. We're actually going to read it again this week. And I just want to do a little bit of recap. But let's go ahead and actually read this scripture together. This is Hebrews 1 through 3. Feel free to read along in the Bible, or you can read along with me here on the screen. But it says, "In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son," speaking of Jesus, "whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven." And so we talked about how in this single passage there are 7 things that are mentioned about Jesus, just pointing out who he is, how amazing he is, and essentially how he is better or superior, which is a theme in the book, to anything else we could hope to build our lives around. And so really this passage to the original audience, which were Jewish Christians, the author is laying out who Jesus is, and he's going to, throughout the whole rest of the book of the Hebrews, continue to point out how Jesus is better, superior to anything else you could choose to pursue, to prioritize, or to build your life around. And so when the original listeners would have read this passage, they would have heard that Jesus is better, specifically better than all the prophets that God sent throughout the Old Testament and the period of the law. And he was the firstborn son of the Father. And so he's just really pointing out that Jesus is supreme. And so last week we only talked about this first of the 7 things, that Jesus is the heir of all things. And we talked about how Jesus is the heir of all things. God is the owner of all things, including all of our things, right? And there's this theme in the scriptures, and we looked at it in terms of Jesus being the heir of all things, that we are the managers or stewards of what God entrusts to us, our time, our resources, our plans, our money, our stuff, everything. And so just to recap where we were last week, and I do want to give a little bit of a clarification because we touched on being generous and having an open hand and being willing to give and giving regularly. And sometimes when I've spoken about this in the past, I've gotten the feedback or the question like, oh, is this talking about giving? Is this like a way to help on the church finances side? Is this just like kind of like a sneaky way of talking about that without talking about it? And so I just wanted to take a moment to clarify, really no is the answer to that question. In fact, at one point, I think somebody had asked, like, did someone pull you aside and ask you to talk about giving? And I just wanted to express from the bottom of my heart, no, this isn't actually an issue that for me is very important because I feel like it bears on our spiritual well-being. For example, in my family, if I felt like in my family we did not have a spirit of generosity and a pattern of giving regularly, then I would be concerned. And in our family meetings on a weekly basis, I would talk about it, right? Because I want my family to be on a great trajectory. And just so you know, we have a great history in this church of great generosity, people that have just faithfully given so regularly. And I believe just God will really bless that. I believe he always will. It's just his nature and his character. But so just so you know kind of where that's coming from on a heart level, it's because I think this is a reflection of our orientation to God as our Father and the owner of all things. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, feel free to see me, but wanted to make that clarification. But what we're going to be talking about today is a completely different topic, actually. And it's the second of those 7 things that are pointed out in Hebrews 1 through 3. And this is a little different than what we normally do. I mentioned last week that in the book of Mark, on a given week, I think I read 70 verses. We read a whole chapter, and then we just talked about certain aspects of it. And I don't know about you, but when you read the Bible, you might have more than one approach to how you read the Bible. And sometimes when I sit down, I'll read a whole book or a whole chapter. But other times, I want to read a little bit and then just think and meditate and get what I can out of that. And so that's a little closer to the spirit of what we're doing in this part of this series, if that makes sense. But this thing, Jesus is the one through whom was made the universe. And this is not the only point in the Bible where this is pointed out, that the universe was made through Jesus. So that's all we're going to talk about today. And you may be wondering, how can you have a whole message based on 6 words? Well, there's actually so much packed in here that I just want to take, again, several moments and just think about what that means. Because you learn a little bit and you gain a little bit of admiration for Michelangelo by looking at the Sistine Chapel, right? You're like, wow, what does that say about this guy? And I think when we take a moment to reflect on the universe, nature, it can give us a newfound appreciation for God, and specifically for Jesus, through whom was made the universe. So, what if I told you that the universe, for thousands of years, has been holding back mysteries that mankind has only recently begun to discover? And that some of these discoveries have been made by the most hardcore atheists and scientifically minded people, and in fact, some of the most intense scientists on the earth. Would you be interested in that? Good, because that's all I have to talk about today. And these discoveries have made people who have no interest in questions about God or his existence or our purpose ask questions about God and his existence and our purpose. I won't tell you that all of them believe in God, but it's brought about some amazing questions. And this, what we're going to talk about today, has actually helped the faith of many people go from atheists or agnostic, not believing or not sure, to believing in God. And so what I'm hoping today will do is help different kinds of people. And so today, if you're a seeker and you're just not sure, honestly, what you think about God, that's fine. We welcome you here. We always want to welcome people that are coming from all different kinds of places, beliefs, non-belief in this church. And so I'm hoping it'll help you. But if you are a believer, but you need from time to time your faith built up or shored up, I'm hoping that this will help you as well. And if you are a strong believer and you don't care about anything about the universe and you don't care about anything about science, well, I don't know. Maybe, maybe you can learn something that you can share with somebody else, okay? And for those of you who are believers and you have strong faith and you love science, you're going to get something out of today too. All right, so I hope there's something in here for everybody. Again, if you don't like this topic, come back again next week and we'll be talking about something else, which will be totally amazing. All right, so we're going to talk about 4 things about the universe today. Are you ready? 4 things that are mind-blowing things about the universe. The first is that the universe is big. You may not have been aware of that. It's estimated that there are 100 billion galaxies, which are huge clusters of stars in the universe. And it's estimated that there are approximately 100 billion stars in each galaxy. So if you want to talk about how many stars that implies there are, that would be, wait for it, this number, which you could say is 10,000 billion billion, or 10,000 million trillion or trillion billion, or 10 sextillion or 10 million quadrillion. You could pick your way of how you want to say it. There's a lot of ways to say this number, but this is approximately how many stars there are in the universe. And you might think, oh, just stars are like pinpricks in the sky. It's like if you pour salt on your table, it kind of looks like that. No, stars, remember, they're like our sun. Think about the size of the sun. The sun is approximately 1 million times bigger than the earth. The earth's pretty big, right? It's 25,000 miles around. So if you think about what that means, people on the equator are spinning around that are like 1,000 miles an hour. you are spinning around like several hundred miles an hour right now. The sun is enormous. It dwarfs the earth. In fact, if I could scale this down just a little bit, just run with this thought experiment for me. If I had a ball up here to represent the sun, like, does anyone have a ball? Okay, thank you. A nice throw. So let's say this is the sun, okay? I've shrunk it down. If this is the sun, the earth would be approximately the size of a peppercorn. That's like a little piece of pepper in your pepper shaker before you grind it up. And I would have to hand it to somebody a couple rows back, and this would be the sun, and the peppercorn in their hand would be the earth. Well, you know Pluto that recently got demoted from planet status? Poor old Pluto. Well, Pluto would be another peppercorn, except smaller than really even a peppercorn. It would be at like Bono's down the street. That's how far away it is. The outer realm of our solar system, which is just our very local neighborhood, would be like another peppercorn at the entrance to I-95, for those of you who are local and not just watching online. That's where that would be. By the way, the next star, the closest star out of the 100 or 10 million quadrillion stars, the closest would be another ball in Quebec. That's the closest star. That's how much space there is between them. And the outermost realm of the universe would actually be another ball, but it would still be in outer space. Like outer space after we scaled everything down to the sun is this size. So we're actually back into outer space. So the universe is huge on a level that it's difficult to even appreciate. The second thing I want to tell you is that the universe is weird. And it has weird things in it, but they're very, very cool. So this is a picture of a neutron star. I know it looks like an alien dinosaur hatching from an egg, but it's a neutron star. I took this picture in my backyard as well. And I know it's wonderful. Neutron stars form from stars that are bigger than our sun, and they explode, and then their inner core forms, and it's so much mass, and it gets so dense that it's denser than anything you can imagine. In fact, I think I couldn't remember, so I wrote it down, just exactly how dense it is. Yeah, if you have a matchbox size of material from a neutron star, it weighs 3 billion tons. 3 billion tons in something the size of a matchbox. And neutron stars, many of them are spinning so fast, they're emitting electromagnetic pulses at a rate of up to 700 plus rotations and beams per second. They can spin as fast as 1/4 of the speed of light. And so the ones that have an axis, the spinning axis that's off of their magnetic axis, they emit this lighthouse-like beam 700 plus times a second. And so these are simply amazing, amazing things. So the universe is quite weird. But that's not all. The third thing is that the universe had a beginning. And so we're going to go into a bit of science here. You know, in Genesis, describes the beginning of the universe, but for many hundreds and even thousands of years, many scientists and philosophers did not think that was true. They thought the universe has always existed and has always looked exactly like we see it right now. And so that was the standard view of, I think fair to say, most thinkers, most philosophers, and most scientists. But in relatively recent terms, that began to change. And part of it started with this guy. His name is Edwin Hubble. You ever heard of his name? The Hubble telescope was named for him. And he was an astronomer. And in the 1920s, he discovered that seemingly that everything in the universe was moving apart from everything else. And that has certain implications. Because if you think about what that means, if you rewind the tape in your mind, if everything's expanding and you go backwards in time, that means everything was closer and closer together. And if you work that out logically, at a certain point in time, the entire universe was, it's hard to even think of it, they call it a singularity. But the universe began at a certain point in time. And you've probably heard the term Big Bang, right? Big Bang theory. And so for many believers, this is kind of like an anathema concept they don't like at all. But the ironic thing is that when this proposal was made, or when the evidence was discovered, for many people, they didn't like it because it actually led in the direction of implying that the universe had a beginning and therefore had a cause, right? Because in our common experience, everything that begins has a cause, right? And whatever the cause is was not part of space and time. So whatever the cause is outside of space and time. Well, that sounds like you're starting to talk about God-type stuff there, and many people didn't like that. And this was the reaction of some scientists. You've perhaps heard of Einstein. He said this idea irritates me. In fact, little fact about Einstein, when he created his general theory of relativity, he put a factor in that didn't really make sense and wasn't justified because he wanted to make it come out so that the universe could have always existed. This was around 1915. He later said that was probably the biggest mistake of his life. Interesting. Some other scientific comments from scientists, they found the idea of the beginning of the universe repugnant. I would like to reject it. It's distasteful to the scientific mind. Again, primarily, I think, because it implies the question, it began? Who began it? How did it begin? But at the same time, I think this is where you got to give scientists some credit because everybody believes there was a beginning now, even though they don't like the idea. And so I think fair enough, give some credit there. Well, this theory gained a ton of steam, and I think it was 1965. These two guys, don't they look kind of gangster for scientists? I don't know. They look so cool. Their names are Penzias and Wilson, and they were working with a satellite in New Jersey, and they kept picking up this signal. They couldn't figure out what it was. They thought it was bird droppings, but eventually they kept narrowing it down, and someone helped them figure out what it was. It was basically evidence that the universe had a beginning. It's called cosmic microwave background radiation. And this was like the evidence that was the clincher, that the universe did in fact have a beginning. So since that time, people have come around to this belief that the universe had a beginning, but it was against the grain of hundreds and thousands of years. Fascinating, right? The universe had a beginning. This was a quote by one of those two guys you just saw in the picture. Penzias said, mind-blowing, "The best data we have are exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, the Bible as a whole." Totally amazing. The universe had a beginning. And now we're going to move to the fourth and final mind-blowing thing about the universe. And that is that it appears to be miraculously fine-tuned for life to exist at all. And this is a relatively recent development. For, again, hundreds and thousands of years, no one thought this. There was no evidence that people are aware of. And then in the 70s, and then building steam until now, this has become a universally recognized reality that the universe appears to have been fine-tuned for life to exist. And this comes down to, I'm going to be brief here because I know if you guys not everybody is a science person, but just, gaze at the Sistine Chapel for a little bit, right? So we can upgrade in a little bit of appreciation. Things like the force of gravity, strong and weak nuclear forces, and electromagnetic forces. These are key forces in nature, as well as the size and electrical charge of protons, neutrons, and electrons, which, as you know, are subatomic particles, the building blocks of everything, literally everything. And then other things like the initial conditions of the universe, how much mass there was, something called the Cosmological Constant, that's an energy that pushes things outward. And many, many, many of these things theoretically could have any strength. They could be the strength 10 units or 100 units or a billion units or a trillion units or a tenth or a thousandth. But over and over, each one has a value that if you moved it to a minuscule degree, left or right, up or down, no life would be possible. No balance of stability and complexity within the universe, which would mean no life possible. Again, I've read over a dozen books on this. I haven't seen anybody that disagrees that it appears that the laws of physics, the fundamental constants of physics, appear to be miraculously fine-tuned to let life exist. If you're a person of faith, if you're a person of seeker, that can cause you to think for a little bit, right? Because the idea is, what are the odds? And it's been calculated, and this is a real thing. I know it's going to sound like hyperbole. It's been calculated that the odds against all these things lining up to allow life to exist would be like the probability of throwing a dart from outer space at a bullseye on Earth that is less than a millimeter wide and hitting it. I mean, I could go on and on. If I told you I could flip 100 heads in a row with a coin, would you believe me? A real coin? What if I told you I could flip 100 times and it would land on the edge 100 times? That's the kind of probabilities we're talking about here. It's been estimated that the probability that this would happen by chance is 1 over a number that you can't write. Because if you tried to write it with 1 and a bunch of zeros, it would have more zeros in it than there are atoms in the universe, and you would run out of atoms. This is no joke. I mean, this would be like if we went out on the lawn after church, and in the grass, some of the blades of grass had died, but they died in such a way that they spelled out a message. And the message was, Poi Tang did this dastardly deed. And some of us would say, I think Poi Tang did this. And some people say, no, Poi Tang was framed. But nobody would say, hey, occasionally a blade of grass dies. And it's possible that just the ones that happen to spell out this message died on this given day within 1 hour. It is possible, isn't it? But the probability against that is what? You can't express it. It's a trillion to 1, or whatever you want to say. It approaches the infinite. So the universe appears to be miraculously fine-tuned for life. I have a couple quotes here from Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking, you may have heard his name even if you're not a science buff. He's kind of like the Einstein of our age, essentially. He's not a believer, but he's written some amazing and interesting things. I've read several of his books, but he says, the laws of science, as we know them at present, contain many fundamental numbers, like the size of the electric charge of the electron, and the ratio of the masses of the proton and the electron. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. Another quote, he said, the odds against a universe like ours emerging are enormous. I think there are clearly religious implications. Again, not a believer, but to get somebody like that, that's metaphysically starting from a point of not even questioning the existence of God, that's actually amazing. It would be very difficult, he says, to explain why the universe should have begun in just this way, except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us. That's from the very rarely read but bestseller, A Brief History of Time, that he wrote. Totally amazing. Miraculously fine-tuned. And just to give you a little bit more appreciation for this, of course, not everybody believes in God. Even the people who recognize this don't believe in God. But it's interesting to see where they go with alternative explanations. It's just interesting. And I'm not speaking on this as an expert. I've dug as much into it as I can, but I'm clearly not an expert. But two of the most commonly recurring explanations that I've heard is something called the multiverse theory and the weak anthropic principle. I'm going to explain to you what those are. So you're going to learn something today you might not have known coming in. The multiverse theory is that there are infinity, approximately, like near infinity, of universes that exist parallel to ours. And because there's infinity or millions and billions and billions, yes, it's amazing that ours is fine-tuned, but that's offset by the fact that there's billions and billions of other universes that don't permit life because the constants aren't adjusted. Well, good question. What is the evidence for that? There's no evidence. There can be no evidence. But that's a theory that many serious scientists and thinkers hold, because what do you do as an alternative to just saying, somebody set this up? That's amazing. The weak anthropic principle is interesting because it says, well, it's interesting. Yeah, of course things appear to be finely tuned for life to exist, because if they weren't, then life wouldn't exist and we wouldn't be here talking about it. Which has a certain amount of logic to it, doesn't it? But it doesn't really explain a whole lot. So there was a philosopher who had a rebuttal to this. He said, suppose I come running to you and I tell you this story that I was captured and kidnapped and gagged and I was to be executed. And 100 of the world's best sharpshooters all surrounded me and they blindfolded me and they were all going to fire on me at the same time. But all 100 of them at the exact same time missed. And you say, Well, of course they missed, or else you wouldn't be here telling us this story. It's true. But it doesn't explain anything. Well, anyway, the point is, to me, the alternatives are as interesting as anything else to what people come up with. So when you reflect on these things, the universe is amazingly large on a scale you can't even fathom. It's full of amazing, incredible things like neutron stars. It had a beginning going against the thinking of some of the smartest people in history. And it appears to be miraculously fine-tuned for life on a razor's edge. How do you feel when you think Jesus, the Son, was the one through whom that universe was made? What does it make you think about Jesus? Again, the theme of Hebrews is he's better. He's superior to anything else and anyone else that you can pursue and follow and prioritize. Do you believe that he's competent? Do you believe that he's capable? Do you believe that he's equipped? Because we all have problems, right? And we all have things in our lives, and we all have potential distractions. But this is the Jesus that we want to follow. This is the Jesus that we want to imitate and worship and honor and obey and love. You're going to ask yourself the question, does he have a plan? Does this Jesus have a plan? Does he have a plan in place for you? I want to read you scripture. We won't put it on the screen, but I just want to read it. In Psalm 8, verse 3. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man, that you care for him. You made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. The Jesus through whom the universe was made has set you in a position of honor. Amazing. And last week we talked about this idea. We're going to transition to communion here. And communion is a time where we really just focus on Jesus, which is the whole point of today's lesson and the whole point of this series. We specifically focus on Jesus, his life, his teaching, his work on the cross, and his resurrection. We talked about last week how we're here on this earth as managers and stewards, and we want to ask the question, God, what do you want me to do with this life? What do you want me to do with this time? What do you want me to do with my time here on earth, with my energy, with my ambition, with my plans, with my money, with my stuff, with everything that you've put at my disposal? What do you want me to do? And this Jesus through whom the universe was made, do you think you can trust him to do that? I want you to think about that and reflect on that as we take communion and throughout this week. And I want to close with another psalm that's just inspiring. And again, it should draw our admiration to the one through whom the universe was made. Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky proclaims the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they communicate knowledge. There is no speech. There are no words. Their voice is not heard. Their message has gone out to the earth, and their words to all the ends of the world. Let's go ahead and pray as we reflect on Jesus and get ready to take communion together. Father, we do want to honor your Son during this time. We do want to take some moments, God, throughout our life to just marvel at what you've made. It's stunning, and it does tell us things about who you are, your character, and your nature. We do want to honor you. We want to give you the proper place as enthroned above and over the universe. God, to recognize that it's through your creation and that we're sustained only through you. We're grateful for Jesus, for every aspect of who he is, but also his life on earth, his teachings, his example, his sacrifice for us, and his intense love, as Anikan was talking about earlier today. Pray that we're able to just honor you, love you, obey you, and draw closer to you during this time. In Jesus' name, amen.